There's a story about a 5-year-old boy named Derek. He came home one day from kindergarten with a tooth in an envelope. He went to his mother named Annette, hugged her, and told her about this tooth and that he lost it while he was at school. So the mother told him, "Okay, tonight, make sure you put it underneath your pillow. Otherwise, you won't get a $10 bill the next day." Derek replied, saying, "You really expect me to believe that some funny looking person dressed in a pink tutu comes into my room at night and takes my old tooth and leaves $1?" Drake asked. "I'm in kindergarten now, Mom. I don't believe in baby stories anymore." "Oh no," the mom said. "If you don't believe in the tooth fairy, I guess we'll just throw it away and you won't get anything but a new tooth in its place. I'm so sorry. I thought you were a believer." The mom walked away. She walked out of the room and took the envelope with her. A few minutes later, Derek's sister named Lisa, his older sister, said, "Derek, you dummy. Um, do you know how many dollars I got from the Tooth Fairy? I got enough to buy a Barbie. Think of all the money you won't get. Think of that new Star Wars toy you really wanted." A minute later, Derek came back to his mother and said, "Hey, Mom, about that Tooth Fairy thing. I forgot. I thought you meant that other fairy, like the one from Wizard of Oz. I believe in the Tooth Fairy. I hope you still have the old tooth." Some people are willing to believe in anything as long as it benefits them. Real faith isn't always confidence. Sometimes it costs a believer. It's not always convenient. Sometimes it costs a believer. And today we're actually going to be looking at three men, looking at Daniel's friends, where believing in God nearly cost them their lives. We are continuing our series in the book of Daniel. We're looking at probably one of the most famous accounts in all of Scripture. Now, as a child growing up in a Christian household, this particular story was viewed a little differently. It was told in a very different way, particularly in the child series known as Veggie Tales. We see instead of a big golden statue, it was a giant chocolate bunny. But the message of the story is still the same. We're continuing from last week where we looked at how King Nebuchadnezzar, he had a dream about a big statue. He learned about how he was the head of gold on the statue. The statue was different metals and even some of it was clay, but he represented the head of gold. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, when he heard that he was a head of gold, he decided to kind of take that and run with it a little bit. So as we take a look into Daniel chapter 3, we'll take a look at our first point where we see creation of the false god. We see the creation of the false god. So starting off in Daniel chapter 3, verse 1, it says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Now, some Bibles might give the measurements of 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. It's roughly about the same. That's close to the same amount, just different measurements. A cubit is the distance between your elbow and your middle finger, which that can be about 1.5 to 2 feet. So, so with 60 cubits equaling 90 feet, it's right around there. So, but the main thing that we're seeing here is that King Nebuchadnezzar decided to make this massive statue, this huge statue, 90 feet high. Friends, that's roughly a 9-story building. King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to make a statement with this. Now, if you go to Washington, D.C., you sometimes see different memorials, you see monuments, might see different statues, or even if you go to different battlegrounds. I know my family has gone to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, home of the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, and there are several different statues just to commemorate of who was in charge of that time, or maybe a particular regiment. No one's worshiping these particular memorials or statues. It's just to remember of what had happened, whether if it was in DC with different war memorials or different statues, of just to remember. There's no worshiping at all. But no matter what the case, in those particular areas, people are just trying to make a statement, trying to remember those who had fallen, the various sacrifices that were made in different wars or in different time periods of our nation's history. But in this particular case, King Nebuchadnezzar made a 90-foot high statue of pure gold. I think he's trying to make something very clear here. See, this wasn't a time where he's saying, remember Babylon and all those who have fallen in the past. He's saying, I am the greatest in the world. Babylon is more powerful than anyone else. He wanted to make sure that everyone knew that he was more powerful than they were. The real issue here that King Nebuchadnezzar had was pride. That was the main struggle that King Nebuchadnezzar was going through right now. Because, well, he experienced God in the previous chapter. Because if you remember the dream that was had last week, God gave him that dream. God gave him the dream of this statue, and that this rock then came and destroyed the statue, and then it blew away, but then the rock, it grew into a mountain. That was God working through King Nebuchadnezzar. And then Daniel interpreted the dream for him and talked about how a coming Messiah was to be expected. There's a coming Messiah, there will be only one kingdom. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar, he hasn't fully understood how to worship the one true God. He most likely acknowledged God, but he said, no, like, I will worship him, but I'm going to worship all these other gods too. And he still wanted to make sure everyone knew that Babylon was powerful, that he was the greatest king in the world. But with this, he also gave a particular command. We see this in verses 4 through 5. It says, then the herald loudly proclaimed, this is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So not only is King Nebuchadnezzar making this statue, trying to say, hey, I am more powerful than anyone here, but you must worship this God. You must worship this false idol, this man-made idol. And so then there's a struggle there, because then we see in verse 6, it says, whoever does not fall down in worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. Yeah, that sounds fair, right? Worship the thing that I made, or you die. That's fair, right? Well, in verse 7, we see that when all these different instruments were played, all the horn, the flute, the zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. I mean, he had one choice there. It's like either worship or die. So it's not exactly a great strategy and loyalty. I mean, sure, it might work for people to just follow your every lead. It's like follow me or die. I mean, that's pretty convincing, but that's not true leadership. That's not true loyalty. And we also see that there are three men who chose to not bow down in our next section. We see that in our next section, the refusal to worship the false god. That's our second section today. The refusal to worship the false god. This is starting in verse 8. It says, at this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. Verse 11, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. So these men, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these are the three friends of Daniel. Now in here, they're given the reference of their Babylonian names, which that's okay. We'll just be using that. But these are the three friends of Daniel. And so with them being Jews, they decided to not worship this man-made idol. And we've seen their devotion in previous chapters. We saw that they and Daniel, they chose to not partake in the king's choice food because it would defile themselves. And they also decided to pray to God while Daniel was praying for the interpretation of the king's dream. So these three young men, they were on fire for God. They served God with great faith. Now, with this particular account, people might think like, oh, like they just happened to see them not worshiping. But the actual thing is, it wasn't necessarily devotion to the king, as in like, hey, we found these men who are not worshiping you, oh great king. It was they're trying to get rid of these Jews. Because if you remember in the previous chapters, Daniel and these three men, they were they were considered 10 times wiser, 10 times better than the astrologers and the magicians of the king. And these men, they're still very young. Now we don't know the whole time, the exact time frame between chapters 1 and 2 and chapter 3. We do believe it's several years later, but we're not exactly sure on that time frame. But I believe that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're still very young at this time. And so most likely these astrologers, the king's wise men, they didn't really wanted to focus on loyalty to the king. They just wanted to get rid of these Jews. That's all they wanted to do. The jealousy of these for these Jews, they just wanted to find some way to get rid of them. And so as they were worshiping this false idol, the king's wise men, they saw that these three Jews, they weren't worshiping. And they said, now's our chance. Now we can get rid of them. And so continuing on, we see that starting in verse 13, it says, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So the king, very upset, very furious, as we see here, he's furious with rage. He's like, wait a second. Why aren't you worshiping the God that I have made? I have made this. I've issued a decree. If you don't worship the thing that I made, you die. And so he said, okay, I'm going to give you one last chance. If you don't do it this time, you're going to die. I'll throw you into the fiery furnace, the blazing furnace. He wanted 100% participation in this event. But then we see in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So these men are saying, hey, we're not worshiping this God that you made, this false idol. We know we will worship our God and he will rescue us from your hand. But even if he doesn't, we will not worship this gold idol that you have made. We will not worship this false image, this man-made image. So these men, they did not solely believe in a miracle that God will just magically make them healed. They would be rescued, but they had faith in God's sovereignty. They believed that God would rescue them. But if they did not live, they would die as martyrs. So in either case, they knew they would win. They said, hey, God is going to rescue us. He's going to do something great here. But if he chooses to not rescue us, if we are meant to die right now, we're going to be labeled as martyrs here on earth, but then we get to live with God in heaven. So in either case, they win. And they knew that. They knew that if they did not worship this golden statue, that they were going to die. They knew what they were doing. And then we go into verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So before I continue on with that, I was a little bit curious here on this particular furnace. And most likely, this furnace was the same one that was used to melt the gold for the statue. So this was a pretty hot furnace. And because they're making such a big statue, most likely it was a fairly big furnace as well. And I was curious on the melting point of gold. How hot does gold have to be in order for it to melt? With several searches online, I have found that the melting point for gold is 1,943 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot. And King Nebuchadnezzar ordered that the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. So just rounding up here, the king wanted this to be 14,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, is that the exact temperature that it was at that time? I'm not sure. But what we can understand with the rage of Nebuchadnezzar, with him saying he wants it 7 times hotter, he not only wanted these men to die, he just wanted them completely gone without a trace. That's how furious and angry King Nebuchadnezzar was. So continuing on in verse 21, it says, so these men were wearing their robes, toras, turbans, and other clothes were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent, and the furnace was so hot, that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the furnace was so hot that the soldiers, the ones who were supposed to just transport Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, literally they're just taking them to throw them into the fire, throw them into the furnace. They died. These soldiers died and they didn't even get into the furnace. It was just that hot. That's how intense these flames were. That it killed these soldiers who they never touched the flame. And yet they died. So verse 23, and these men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. And so typically, that's the end. Typically, the king and the soldiers say, okay, everyone got the picture? Worship me, or this is going to happen to you. It shows the king that he's not joking around. He just killed 3 men, 3 of his main advisors, 3 of his wisest men in Babylon. But then we look at verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked the advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, O king. Verse 25, he said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods. The king looked into this furnace and he saw a 4th person. Even though they threw in 3, there was this new person who got in there. This fourth person is Jesus. This is one of the pre-incarnations of Jesus Christ, who came into the fire and saved these men. He was with them in the fire. And then we continue to our third point, starting in verse 26. It's the worship of the true God. So our third and final point, the worship of the true God. Nebuchadnezzar then approached, this is in verse 26, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. But even if you have some candles for a birthday cake, if that little flame hits a finger, like there's some redness left over. Like it might hurt like a little. It's not exactly a third-degree burn or anything. It's like there's some redness. Maybe put some cold water on it, some ointment, but like that's it. But friends, these men were thrown into a furnace, their whole bodies in the middle of the flames, and yet they didn't even smell like fire. If you've gone camping, and if you have like a campfire, most likely you might smell like smoke if you're working on the fire a lot. Or even if you're barbecuing, you might smell like the flames, the charcoal, the wood. And back in Christian camping, I definitely had a lot of clothes that smelled like fire. But it's even like days after it smelled like fire. But for these men, it's like their clothes didn't even smell like fire. Not a single hair was singed. Verse 28, we see Nebuchadnezzar. He said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. That's how much faith these men have. And God rescued them. They knew their life was on the line, but they still chose to worship the one true God. And starting in verse 29, therefore, this is the king, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So we see King Nebuchadnezzar, he's acknowledging God. He's acknowledging the one true God. I think his approach on worship still needs a lot of work. Because he threatened people that they would be thrown into the blazing furnace if they didn't worship this false idol. But now he's saying if you don't worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, aka the one true God, you'll be cut into pieces and your houses be turned into rubble. Again, great that you're acknowledging the one true God and you're encouraging the worship of the one and only God, but maybe not threaten them with death. That might be a good way to adjust your mindset when it comes to worship. Now, we will see later on in this series how King Nebuchadnezzar still struggles with the worship and understanding of God and how to encourage people to worship God. But because of what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did, the king promoted these three men in the province of Babylon, giving them even more authority. Now, if we think about it, the wise men that hated Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they wanted to find a way to kill them. They thought they finally found the solution they were looking for, but instead of getting rid of them, they were made even wiser and even promoted in the kingdom, given more authority. Almost like you just can't not get rid of God's people. And so, with all this going on, what is our application? The first one is do not be deceived by man made idols. Don't be deceived by these man made idols. Now, we might not have statues of gold today. We don't have that. But what else do we have? Probably one of the most famous ones is phones. That's probably the most famous one, isn't it? Another famous one is money. These are man-made items. Now, yes, this is very useful. I can contact Marjorie if I'm in an emergency. I can contact some of my friends who I haven't seen in years, but if we put this in front of God, then it's a sin. Money is the same way too. Money is useful. It helps pay our bills. We can get food for a little Hattie. We can keep the heat on when it's cold outside. But if we put money in front of God, then it's a sin. Don't be deceived by these man-made idols. In fact, there might be a man-made idol that's not even visible. King Nebuchadnezzar had issues with pride. I might not be able to see pride physically. I can see the reaction to pride. We saw the reaction to pride with the king because he made this 90-foot statue. But we can't see pride in your heart. It's tough to see that for us humans. We can see the reaction of pride. So don't be deceived by these man-made idols. Second, stand with God when the world says to walk away. Stand with God when the world says turn away. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for years, they have been surrounded by people who are telling these men to forget your God and worship this man-made idol. Even threatened them with their lives. And yet they said, no, we're standing with God. We will not worship these other idols. We will worship the one true God. It's easy to do what the world says. It's easy to just go with the flow in a way because you want to be popular. You don't want to be an outcast. You want to have friends, but these men stood with God. and he performed an amazing miracle. And these men knew, hey, God might rescue us, he might not, and we're okay with that because they knew they would win either way. They knew that God is going to perform a great miracle, or they were going to be living with God in heaven. It was a win-win scenario. And finally, God is with you, even in the fire. Now, I'm not necessarily referring to a physical fire like what we saw here in this account. But God is with you even in your struggles, even in your lowest of times. God has never left you. He's there with you. He said this with God said that he was with you to Moses, with Joshua. The famous quote from the book of Joshua is, the Lord will never leave you nor forsake you. As in, he'll never leave you, and forsake, that means abandon. So God's not going to leave you nor forsake you. And with the time of Joshua, that was centuries before the time of Daniel. So if God was with Joshua then, and if he's with these men now, you think he's still with us today? I think so. God has never left us. Whether if we're in the fire or not, he is still with you. Let us close in prayer.